Hi everyone, it's Melissa, and I am here today to share with you the books I read as part of the TBR Clear Out Readathon hosted this past April by Katie from Books and Things. The whole point was to read those books that have been sitting on your shelves that you're just, for one reason or another, not picking up or not compelled to pick up, and just get them off your TBR. So I read this short story collection, Fragile Things by Neil Gaiman. Like all short story collections, or at least in my experience, always tend to be a little bit of a mixed bag. I think it's pretty rare to find a short story collection where you jive with every single story, but I will say this one was pretty good for the most part. There were only a couple stories that were just kind of meh for me. I didn't find any of them like annoying, so that's great. And for the most part, I enjoyed them. And there are a couple stories in here that I really, really liked. It's kind of hard to say what a short story collection's about, but I think if you're wondering kind of like the tone, it's very, I would say, atmospheric, spooky in spots, dark in spots, a bit weird overall, but I liked it. There's a lot of like fairy tale and myth and that kind of stuff woven into a lot of these stories because that's something that Neil Gaiman does a lot, and it's something that I really enjoy reading. So if you enjoy elements of fairy tale and folklore and mythology, you would probably enjoy this. So the next book that I read was The Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Neffenegger. And this one was like enjoyable, but I would call it just an okay read. I think overall I was really engaged while reading it. It's a very plot driven book. So I found myself turning the pages to find out like what happens with these characters. It's about a man, Henry, who time travels unwillingly. He gets pushed forward and backwards through time. He has no control over it. And it's the story of him and his wife, Claire, who, when they meet for the first time, or when Henry meets her for the first time in their 20s, she has known him since she was 6 years old. So, like I said, very plot driven. I was really engaged reading it, wanting to know what happens to them, what happens to Henry. What would have made this a better read for me is if she dove in more to more of the existential crisis of this book. As you can imagine, if you're time traveling, you have a sense of what is going to happen. There was a little bit of talk in here about like determinism versus like free will. Like, can you change the future? But anytime you try to change the future, like it still ends up as Henry has seen it. But that was just kind of touched on briefly, not really explored. And I felt like we didn't get to know the characters intimately. Like, how do they feel knowing what they know? Henry knows things about his own fate, about the fate of the couple, about the fate of other people in their lives, good and bad, but it doesn't really delve into like how does he feel knowing that? Like, how does that affect him? So I would have liked a more deep character exploration, I think, of like how knowing too much about your own future and the future of your loved ones would weigh on you. So the next book I'm kind of dreading talking about because this is a beloved book, high ratings on Goodreads. All of the reviews I looked up praised this book. It is a classic love tale, but is it really? It is Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I'm just going to say right now, if you are interested in reading this, to skip ahead. I may or may not say some spoilery things. I'm not sure yet exactly how I want to explain this book, but I hated it. And I need to explain why. Okay, I guess I should stop here and put in some trigger warnings because I'm going to be discussing sexual assault, child molestation, and maybe some other very unpleasant things having to do with um, rape. And yes, if those things are things you don't want to hear about, please skip ahead. So, people call this a love story. And I just want to say right off the bat, this is not a love story. This is the story of two people who thought they were in love when they were very young and who wrote letters back and forth to each other. And then she ended up marrying someone else, and she was married to that other person for 50 years. And then the other man, her first lover, who they barely spoke 10 words to each other, they just wrote letters to each other, he pines for her for 50 years, and then the day of her husband's funeral comes to her and says, I've been waiting for this day, so now we can finally be together. What? No. Furthermore, one of the main protagonists, oh my god, what's his name? Florentino? Florentino. So he's the man who pines for, oh my gosh, I can't remember the characters' names. What's her name? He pines for Fermina. So Florentino is written as this, this lovesick man who is pining for this woman, and you're supposed to feel pity for him. He's a rapist. So towards the end, when he's older, so he's in his 70s, he is the guardian of like his second cousin or something. He takes in some girl into his home. He's her guardian. She's like 13 years old, and they start a relationship. i.e., he grooms her. There's a section in here where it actually writes him like playing this game about like how he's tricking her into doing sexual things by making it into childlike games. And then she and he have this sexual relationship for a couple of years, and then Fermina's husband dies, and then he's like, oh, well, I'm gonna go marry her now. And so then this girl that, like his ward that he's been caring for, kills herself. Yeah. So after I was done reading this, I was so appalled because it's written in this very flowery language, like it's supposed to be a romance. But there are all these details in here that are at least screaming to me, this is not a romance. This is like a really unhealthy, toxic relationship, if you can even call it a relationship. While he's pining for her, he has like over 600 sexual encounters where he basically just treats the women like objects and disposable, like he's the worst. Florentino is the worst. So after I was done reading this, I thought, okay, maybe there's something I'm just not getting. So I started Googling reviews for this because I needed to figure out what the heck I was missing. 99.9% of what I found was people saying what a great like love story this is, like coming together in old age, like after 50 years apart, and it was like a triumph. I wrote down this, someone called it boldly romantic. What's boldly romantic about a rapist, pedophile who stalks a woman for 50 years and then feels entitled to her after like the day her husband dies? Okay, so I did find something. I didn't find this in any like reviews, but I did find a couple of like people's like essays and like maybe even a thesis. They're more like academic writing. So I read them. So that's when I learned about something called narrative, like seductive narrative. So essentially, if I'm understanding it correctly, if you do read between the lines here, Gabriel Garcia Marquez has made it abundantly clear that Florentino is awful, that he's not just some lovesick man who is, longing for his long lost love. He's making it clear by Florentino's actions he's, not a good person, that he's trivializing love, that he doesn't really know what love is, but that the way it's written, the narrative of how it's written, is supposed to seduce you. So like narrative as seduction. So like the reader is seduced by the way the prose is written to make you feel like it's a love story, but if you're actually reading the words, it's clearly not. That, if I'm understanding those essays that I read correctly, that's what seductive narrative is. Okay, so I get that. He's obviously a talented writer, so he's able to do that. However, this explanation just is not enough for me, because yes, I think it's fine for an author to maybe steer you down a path or make you feel a way when everything that the character's doing should not, like, there are tons of novels out there with protagonists that you root for even though they're in the wrong, or they're villains in a sense. Like there are ways to make you care about a character even when they're unlikable. So I think that's fine, but I think this novel plays into rape culture in such a way that it makes me really uncomfortable. And the thing is, when I Google and I can't find anyone talking about the problematic parts in this and everyone just touting it as boldly romantic, then I think maybe you did narrative seduction a little bit too well and that you have to give the reader a little bit more direction, because now people are seeing what? They're seeing a rapist as a romantic. And I will say, it wasn't just like, him tricking you into caring about this character who's like doing awful things. There are other kind of like throwaway lines that are also beyond problematic in terms of like rape culture. I'm going to find this passage that is seared into my brain and I'm going to read it to you so that you can see what I mean. Context here is Florentino is with this other woman, I forget her name. I think they work together, or they know each other quite well. He's at her house. I think he like touches her thigh or something. And she replies to this by the following. "Behave yourself," she said. "I realized a long time ago that you were not the man I am looking for." Then it describes a time where she is a young woman. She's middle-aged at this point, but she's telling the story of when she was a young woman, where she was grabbed and raped over some rocks. It is romanticized and makes me want to throw up. It says, "Lying there on the rocks, her body covered with cuts and bruises, she had wanted that man to stay forever so that she could die of love in his arms. From that time on, she would say to anyone who would listen to her, 'If you ever hear of a big, strong fellow who raped a poor black girl from the street on Drowned Men's Jetty one October 15th at about 11:30 at night, tell him where he can find me.'" So basically she's been pining over her rapist for decades. Isn't that fabulous? I hated this so much that I want to scream. So if you like this, please comment below and tell me why. Is there something I am missing? Because with the way this handles rape victims, and like, I'm not here for it. I'm just not. I'm not. So thankfully, after reading that dumpster fire, I got a lovely palate cleanser. Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I have never read any Jane Austen. This book has been on my TBR for like 10 years or longer. And I'm 35 years old. Why? Why did I wait so long to read this novel? I loved this so much. I think one of the reasons I had put it off so long, I think there's two reasons. One, being intimidated by classics and like the language and not understanding, which I will say, if you don't read any classics and you want to get into it, I found this very readable. I think it helped that this edition had like footnotes to explain some of the vocabulary or some of maybe like things that you might not pick up on if you didn't know like anything about this time period. So that made it more readable. But even without those footnotes, I feel like Jane Austen writes characters and like the dialogue between them so well that you just get what's happening. You just like understand. So that was one reason, was just like intimidation. And the other was because this is such a renowned book, I think there's a part of me that was just afraid to read it because what if I don't like it? I don't want to be the person that doesn't like Pride and Prejudice, but I mean, clearly it's okay loving or hating books that other people love. It's okay. So, thankfully, I adored this. 5 stars. So good. I am like chomping at the bit now to get my hands on other Austen, but I think she only has like what, like 6 books, something like that. And so maybe I should like space them out and like cherish them more, but I loved this. She just writes characters so well that even if you're not familiar with like the social norms at the time or like about the period, you just get them, you get their motivation. And I feel like when I was reading this and she was, you know, writing these characters who like lived so differently from how I live, I still like, I recognize them. Like I'm reading and I'm like, oh, like I know a Mrs. Bennet. You know what I mean? Like, oh yeah, I know a Darcy too. Like they're people that you know. It just gave me the warm fuzzies. Like you recognize these characters. These characters are timeless. Every time period is going to have these types of people. And it just made it so relatable. And I understand now why this is basically timeless. It just, any time period you're reading this in, it will be applicable. Maybe the whole like needing to get a husband piece of it is not important for the time period you're living in, but the characters are just like, so Austen fans, I am definitely going to read another Jane Austen novel. Probably not in May, but for the summer, I'll read at least another one. So please let me know, what do you think I should read next? Thanks to Katie for like having this readathon. I think it was such a great idea and it just really kind of put the fire under my butt. That's not how that expression goes. Lit a fire under my butt to like grab the stuff that I already have on my shelf that I've been neglecting and putting off. And I'm so glad that I grabbed this. It really was a light in a dark time for me. I know that sounds very dramatic, but things are rough right now. Like we're living in a global pandemic and things are scary, and this was just a joy. So sorry, I ran out of space on my phone before I was able to sign off. So cleared up some space now. I just wanted to say thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope everyone is well. Take care and we'll see you soon. Bye.